waiting for the first panel, Danny.
Yes. I'll give you the. Yeah, it was in the folder.
Yeah, I haven't looked
But
at it yet.
oh no, not. I was saying nobody noticed it. I was already printing out this morning. So. And they ended up at like 4 in the morning. Nobody printed anything. So for today, it was like I think Dee Cleaver and
Yeah, I
Robin.
talked to DZ's communications director yesterday, just because I hadn't got her yet, and she says that he is definitely coming. He will take 100% of the script for questions. He's not going to be taking any risks on this one. He will be
Okay.
focused on
No, it's
answering
fine. I
questions.
talked to the staff earlier. I just told them it's their option if they want to take, at the end of it, so.
Yeah, I mean, I plan to do things with delegating my day risk to this person here, so you can see her not put this class 100% on.
Yeah.
His communications director is very excited.
Oh, his staff is like really nice though.
Oh, she's very nice. They're like, they're like interested in stuff. Like,
Oh, okay.
okay, I didn't know that about all these things.
How about this for that?
she sharing or is she? Okay, so, well, good. Good. Did you have, yeah, good, you like what you said to her, I mean, that's nice. Good. And you were there? Good. Sure, yeah, a lot of noise to speak about.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
We're Helsinki commissioners, and we really want to thank our witnesses that we had an opportunity briefly in the back to learn something about and learn what their priorities are. The name of this hearing today is the State of Diversity and Inclusion in Europe, Race, Rights, and Politics. It's an honor to serve the global community as a member of this Helsinki Commission, and I'm honored today to be joined today to assess the state of diversity and inclusion in Europe. I have the people who have joined me here today. First of all, my good friend Emmanuel Cleaver, from Kansas City, Missouri, who is a member of the Helsinki Commission, but also a member of the Financial Services Committee, is the chairman of the subcommittee that deals with the International Monetary Fund, with the World Bank. And so it is very, very appropriate that he's been appointed to the Helsinki Commission to carry the work of diversity and inclusion into that conversation. I am so pleased on the left here to be with one of our longest-serving members of the Helsinki Commission, the former president of the Helsinki Commission. I mean, the whole 57-member body of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. My mentor, he's been a rapporteur, and certainly been a champion on the state of diversity and inclusion in Europe, race, and long before it became a topic that is as hot as it is today. I just want him to say hello to us for a moment before. Oh, and we've also been joined by Steve Cohen, a commissioner from Memphis, Tennessee. Great traveling partner, but also on our Judiciary Committee, very esteemed member of the Judiciary Committee. Certainly has been very involved on the topic of diversity, inclusion, and anti-Semitism, bringing that voice, which is a really huge problem in Europe as well as other places in the world. So we have a full complement. Even though you see only 4 of us sitting here, this is a full complement of members of the Helsinki Commission that we really want to lean into this discussion. But I would be remiss if I didn't yield to Mr. Hastings for brief remarks.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and my remarks will be brief. I apologize to all of you for having other duties this morning. Someone said it's kind of hard to apologize for working, but the fact is that I do have other responsibilities. But addressing the issues of diversity and inclusion amidst the rising prejudice and xenophobic violence that we've seen both in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere around the world from far-right extremists. When I had the opportunity and privilege of serving as president of the Parliamentary Assembly, I didn't deem it robbery to begin formulation of the structure that gives rise to us being here today, and that is interparliamentary action, particularly for people who live this experience of being discriminated against. And therefore, I'm more than pleased that you all are here and thankful that we have this opportunity. And my hope is that we will have many visits together. And my suggestion in modern times is that we begin using social media in a more active way so that we can stay in contact without having to get on those airplanes to cross the Atlantic and other areas. But thank you for being here, and thank you, Madam Chair, for presiding this morning.
And thank you so much, Mr. Hastings, and we will carry on the work that you have started and inspired all of us to carry on. I can tell you as an African American, I think I speak for Mr. Cleaver too. Since I'm not going to yield to you at this moment, I'll speak for you. You know, who'd have thunk it that there were concerns about racism outside of America? We had become so focused on our counter anti-Semitic and anti-race racism here in the United States that Mr. Hastings engaged us on the global nature of this scourge, and we appreciate him for that. And today's hearing is so timely because it's taking place ahead of the OSCE's annual human rights meeting later this month, which includes a focus on how European and North American governments are responding to hate, crimes, and bias. But it's also taking place ahead of the European Union's first ever Anti-Racism and Diversity Week on the heels of Roma Week, which happened earlier this year. And I'm so proud to serve as an honorary host, to have served as an honorary host last year of Europe's first ever People of African Descent Week, convened in the European Parliament to honor the history and contributions of Europe's 15 to 20 million strong Black population on the occasion of the International Decade for the People of African Descent. Now, I am so pleased that the Helsinki Commission has been a supporter of those initiatives and to be joined here today by the new leadership of the European Parliament's Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup and other European leaders to discuss how these and other events will assist in shaping Europe's path forward in realizing an inclusive society. Here, in addition to our European hearing witnesses, we are also joined in our audience by other international delegates that we had a chance to chat with in the anteroom, from Europe, from the Western Hemisphere, including the French parliamentarians, Olivier Serva, Catherine, just raise your hand. Catherine Conca, the Spanish parliamentarian Rita Bosato, and I'm so pleased that everyone here can be with us here today. It's this hearing today, in context, is taking place at a time when we are receiving numerous reports from Europe of hate crimes and acts of extremism, racial profiling in cities and at borders, and discrimination at work and in the schools. The OSCE has reported close to 6,000 hate crimes in Europe over the past year, 6,000 just in the last year. A recent European parliamentary study concluded that people from ethnic or racial minorities in the EU experience higher risks of economic hardship, poor quality housing, residential segregation, unemployment, and assault. The individual impact of such disparities is quantifiable in lost earnings between 1.8 and 8 billion euros. Americans are also impacted by disparate treatment and related violence in Europe. For years, we've received reports that our diverse military and diplomats serving in Europe, students studying abroad, and tourists have all been the targets of discrimination, from being refused service in restaurants or, to the worst cases, being the tragic victims of hate crimes. So Europe, like the United States, is already diverse, and in a democracy, ethnicity, skin color, religion, gender, and I could go on, should not be determine one's access to rights, protections, and opportunity. Yet, this is what we're seeing. And increasingly, citizens in our democracies are turning against one another and people from other places simply because they look, pray, love, or think differently than someone else. And it's critical that we reaffirm democratic values by challenging rising prejudice and violence with strategies for inclusion. And it's not just an American or European problem. Whether our countries could truly embrace diversity is a litmus test for our democracy and the transatlantic relationship. Brexit, counterterrorism cooperation, trade, migration, data use and protection. These are all transatlantic issues that ultimately impact all of us, regardless of our differences, ensuring that all of our voices are represented in policy decisions of these issues on both sides of the Atlantic are critical to show that our nations will move on. And together, our nations can move forward toward a future in which diverse populations are celebrated, guaranteed human rights, and have an opportunity to participate fully in our societies. And so we're going to welcome your testimony. Are there any of our other commissioners that would like to make an opening statement? I'm sorry about that long opening statement. The staff insisted that I read it into the record. Everything's been said, but does anybody have anything else to say? All right. So I want to turn this over to our expert witnesses and our panel to discuss the diverse populations in Europe. The EU anti-discrimination, diversity, and inclusion policy prescriptions. You guys are all leading as co-presidents of the European Parliament Anti-Racism Diversity Group. The Member of Parliament, Dr. Perrette Herzberger Fofana from Germany, is here with us today. She's the first woman of African descent elected as a member of the European Parliament for Germany from the Green EFA party. She is the first vice president of the Development Committee and a substitute member of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. Welcome. We are so happy to have with us a member of Parliament, Romeo Franz from Germany. Romeo Franz is the first Roma from Germany elected to the European Parliament, and he's the first vice chair of the Culture and Education Committee. Thank you for joining us. We have our member of Parliament, Evan Inser. Did I get it? From Sweden. I have a nephew who lives in Sweden. I'll have to give you his number. She's a member of the European Parliament from Sweden of Kurdish heritage. She serves on the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice, and Home Affairs, and on the delegation to the EU-Turkey Joint Parliamentary Committee. Welcome here today, Evan. We have our member of Parliament. She's a very old lady, 30 years old. Samira Rafaela from the Netherlands. And she is a member of the European Parliament from the Netherlands and a member of the Committee on International Trade and the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. And she's also part of the Eurolot delegation. Ms. Rafaela serves as first vice president, and she's an alumni of the Transatlantic Infusion Leaders Network, co-founded by the Helsinki Commission. And we are so proud of her that she's joining us today in her new capacity, just elected as a parliamentarian. Alfiaz Vaya is the coordinator of the Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup, and he's going to join the panel to address any procedural questions that are related to the intergroup. So we thank you for your expertise. We do have witness bios available so that you can delve further into the excellent background and qualifications of our witness. So this is our first panel, and so I'm going to yield now to our first witness. And we're going to give you 5 minutes. We've learned here as parliamentarians that you can say an awful lot in 5 minutes, but we will make sure that every bit of your comments will be included in the record. So Dr. Herzberger, can we hear from you? We'll hear from you. Can you turn your mic on, please?
So, estimated colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to be here with you and talk about the incredibly important topic of reparation, recognition, and justice. Europe and America, alike were built off the back of black men and women, and in the case of America, over the bodies of indigenous people. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the beginning of World War II, one of the darkest periods in European history, a time when hateful rhetoric and action went unchallenged that resulted in the death of millions and millions of people. There were also many other victims of the Nazi regime, non-European victims, black, have suffered the wrath of the Nazi nevertheless. In Erlangen, the city that I live in Germany, I wanted to start a debate about those victims, history forgotten people, to gain recognition for their pride and justice and for their memories. So in 2015, I founded the Black History Weeks and dedicated the first edition to Afro-German Holocaust survivors. For the first time ever, Theodor Michael, Marie Nejar, and Gerd Schramm came together to share their experiences as Black Germans living in the Third Reich. It was the first time that these three survivors participated together in such an event. Although they all lived in Germany, they had not had the opportunity to take part in such a conference together. Marie Nejar and Theodor Michael were among a group of young Afro-Germans recruited to play a role in racist propaganda films produced by the Nazi propaganda machine. Gerd Schramm was imprisoned in a concentration camp until it was 15 when he was taken to Buchenwald camp, where he remained a year and a half. He was freed when the Americans came and liberated Buchenwald. It was on the 12th of April, 1945. I had the pleasure to be with him that year, 2015, for the celebration. Gerd Schramm died 2016, 1 year after. There are many more stories like these, but they are often left out of political debate about the Nazis and Holocaust, in the same way that Germany tends to ignore its colonial past. We owe more to our ancestors to allow their memories and the sacrifices to be erased from the common conscience. That is why I campaigned for Theodor Michael to be awarded the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, the highest honor in the land, and an award that he was presented with in January 2018 by the Minister-President of the land of Rhineland-North Westphalia. I also wrote to both the President and the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary at the end of the World War II to request that they include mention of all of the African victims and other victims from outside of Europe who perished during the Holocaust. When I received a negative answer from the office of the President, I was disappointed, but not surprised. I don't hold out much hope for a positive response from the Chancellor. The day of the memorial ceremony on the 5th of May 2015 came, and I had heard nothing. Then at Dachau, the first concentration camp opened by the Nazi, Chancellor Angela Merkel said the following of its victim. May I say the quotation? They were men, women, and children. They came from all over Europe. They also came from many other parts of the world, from Asia as well as, and this is still little known to the public, from parts of Africa, Congo, Senegal, and Eritrea. We commemorate the approximately 1,040 people who died, not survived this place. Quotation ended. The next day, I received a letter from her office thanking me for the information and stated that she would use it in her speech. Finally, we achieved official recognition for our brother and sister who perished at the hands of the Nazi. I continue to organize exhibition, conference, and awareness-raising meetings dedicated to increasing the knowledge and recognition of Afro-Germans and diaspora, because without recognition, there can be no reparation. I have one wish. On Saturday, I pay a visit to Mikhail Theodor. Theodor Michael is very, very sick, and I told him that I am going to say that here at the Congress, and my wish is maybe, I don't know it's a wish, but everybody can dream, that we send him a card that the last day of Theodor Michael in the hospital in Cologne. Thank you very much for your attention.
We're happy to hear from you now, Mr. France.
Dear members of the Congress, distinguished colleagues and guests, I would like to express my deepest gratitude for the opportunity to be here today. Please allow me to say a few words about today's date. 18 years ago, many innocent people had to die because of the cowardly attacks. I will never forget these cruel images in my life. But this should reinforce our conviction to fight racism and xenophobia and radicalism and terrorism even more strongly together. This is what we owe those who died, well as their loved ones. May all those who lost their lives rest in peace. Europe has about 12 million Roma, the largest ethnic minority of the continent. Some 6.2 million live in the EU, and most of them hold the citizenship of an EU country. The other live mostly in the Balkan region. Our community encompasses diverse groups, including Roma, Sinti, Kale, Manouche, etc. People with Romani background is broadest on my preferred term because it allows to address all parts of the community and depicts the diversity of people. Despite the fact that all EU countries have adopted anti-discrimination legislation, the majority of Roma in the EU are victims of prejudice, social exclusion, and anti-Gypsyism. This means in numbers that are provided by the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency. 80% of my people live below their country poverty threshold. Every third Roma lives in housing without tap water. Every third Roma child lives in a household where someone went to bed hungry at least once in the previous month. And 50% of Roma between the ages of 6 and 24 do not attend school. In summary, the largest ethnic minority continues to face intolerable discrimination and unequal access to vital services. The reasons for the failures of EU policies so far are diverse. A central matter continues to be a history of anti-Zyganism, engraved in cultural expressions of majority society for the last 600 years, and institutionalized racism on all levels of government, regional, national, and European. Europe does not have a Roma problem, but a racism problem. The European institution and every EU country have a joint responsibility to improve the living conditions and inclusion of the Roma. This spans over most policy files, such as education, employment, healthcare, and housing. Europe was based on that fundamental belief that all people are born equal, regardless the color of the skin, religion, or ethnicity, and this is what must be defended and promoted by its leaders. This is what I'm fighting for. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, very compelling. We are happy to hear from you now.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you so much, members of the Congress. As I said, my name is Evin Inser. I come from the Swedish Social Democratic Party. Right now, I'm serving as a member of the European Parliament just since a few months back. The issue of actually diversity, anti-racism has always followed me. That was actually also one of the reasons of why I myself engaged in party politics to start up with, and then decided to take on public offices after a while. I myself grown up in one of the suburbs of Gothenburg, second biggest city in Sweden, and I saw how the situation of myself and my own friends were, and I saw also how the situation in the other parts of the city was, and I then decided as a 14, 15 years old child back then that I want to do something against it, not that I then believed in party politics, unfortunately. And I think it's the same all over the world. Many people, many young people with immigrant backgrounds in Europe, but also in USA, do not feel that politics is actually people who are serving within the political sphere are representing them always. So I decided that I wanted to take on the challenge and to do something to the current situation. And this was 2001, but the situation has even become worse if we look at many parts of Europe. And unfortunately, in my own country, Sweden, where we see a growing right-wing extremism, more specifically called the Sweden Democrats, and as you also most probably know, the Sweden Democrat representatives were here in the US and met with representatives of the Trump administration. That shows one thing, and that is, or one important thing, and that is that even the right-wing extremist organizations have understood the importance of cooperation and I've started to, within Europe, talk about something more called pan-European nationalistic movement, and is even getting broader and broader. And this is a signal, at least to me, that we need, if they see the importance of cooperating over the national borders, it is important also for us to even understand that part more and make sure that we who believe in equal society and democratic society get together and challenge the ideology that they stand for. And that's an ideology that I would very much want to see decreases rather than increases in Europe, in US, and globally. So I look very much forward to continue the dialogue, and I also hope to strengthen the dialogue between us in Europe and, of course, you here in the States for a better, more equal and democratic world. Thank you very much.
It's just so encouraging, Mr. Hastings, to see these young people emerging. You know that no matter what happens, the work is going to be carried on. That feistiness, we love it. And so we're going to continue on by hearing from Rafaela, member of and congratulations to you too for just being elected to the EU. So you guys belong to the freshman class. You'll always be rabble-rousing together. Okay, Miss Rafaela, let's hear from you.
We're definitely going to team up. We should, yeah. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and also the members of Congress. I really appreciated being here. So thank you again. And yes, I just got elected to the European Parliament, and that has been really special to me because since I was 16 years old, I said, well, if I'm going into politics, I will go into the European Parliament. And often people ask me the question, but why the European Parliament, not the national parliament? Well, first, the European Parliament, we make laws. And laws, when making law, it is extremely important that it happens inclusive, that we engage different communities in our society, that we ask them the question, what is wrong in your community? What are the challenges? What do you want to be engaged in law? And the international context is so extremely important to use when it comes to raising these questions. And that is why I wanted to go into the European Parliament. But also because I have a very international identity myself. I grew up as a daughter from a woman who has Dutch and Caribbean roots and Jewish roots, and my father is Ghanaian, Nigerian, and Muslim. So I grew up with the understanding that there's more than borders. But also I grew up with the understanding that not everyone in this world gets equal opportunities and equal rights. So being in the European Parliament now, I see how extremely important it is to raise the right questions when it comes to lawmaking. But I also see what happens when there's a lack of representation. And that is what I've experienced during my own campaign. I said, well, my campaign will be focused on very different groups, but I want the result that they will say at the end, well, I felt hurt. I felt you were talking for us. I felt like, okay, now I have the feeling that we are getting politicians that can understand what we are going through. And even now in the European Parliament, while we have a bit more diversity, we do have a lack of representation when it comes to different communities in Europe. And I think that's a problem with the rise of racism, with the rise of discrimination. And even in my own country, we are dealing with various challenges. I mean, we have politicians, actually a couple of years, we had a politician saying, well, let's work on less Moroccans in our country. It is unbelievable that we have that in politics, and we need political leadership now in Europe saying, this is wrong, we need to end this, we need to counter it, we need to tackle it. So therefore, as a member of the European Parliament, I will keep working, also being part of RD, on horizontal anti-discrimination legislation. But we also need to raise our voice. We also need to make sure that we think about tactics and strategies that make other people also aware of the situation, but also feel engaged in politics, and maybe they want to go into politics also to help us build on this critical mass we need in politics. So I'm in the committee now on international trade. I'm in the committee on social affairs and employment, and also on women's rights. And when it comes to international trade, it is so extremely important that we work and we keep build on these agreements that make sure that trade can also be used for having peace in the world. And I am worried now about how it's going between the USA and between Europe, for example. We need to work on the agreements that make us better. We need to work on the agreements that foster sustainability and peace by these trade agreements. But also when it comes to employment, what about discrimination in the workforce? What about equal opportunities for youth? We are dealing now with youth unemployment in the world and in Europe. And I've seen myself working for the police in the Netherlands that when you don't work on social equality, you will get the challenges in security. I mean, that is why I studied radicalization and terrorism. I wanted to know what triggers people to radicalize, what triggers people to do these kind of activities. And there are causes that has to do with social and economic inequality. So we really need to work on that. And then women's rights, also in Europe. Women are not always safe. We are still dealing with the position, the socio-economic position of women, but also their safety. So I think we have a lot to exchange with each other. But at the end, I think that one of the main issues is the lack of representation. We need to work on representation in politics, because these are the voices that can explain what's going on in society. These are the voices that can make sure that lawmaking is inclusive, that our agreements are inclusive. And I am really worried about the lack of young people, about the lack of women, about people of color, LGBTI, people with an LGBTI background. So we are not there. And I think that's something that we can speak about today, share our worries, but also speak about the strategies that we can develop together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so we're going to have a couple of remarks before we get into the Q&A period from Alfiaz Vaya. He's the coordinator of the European Parliament Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup. Very important. He's going to help us negotiate this conversation. Just introduce yourself again.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting us to speak again, and it's my pleasure to speak alongside such great members of European Parliament, and especially who I think in the future will become the rising stars and the people who will carry this fight in the future. I think what's important to talk about is to put everything into context, what we're seeing in Europe. So we've heard many of the different cases and incidents in Europe, but in the 28 EU member states, we see that far-right nationalist parties are now actually joining the governments. So in a majority of the 28 member states, we see far-right political parties actually in government as part of the coalition. Just in the past couple of weeks, we saw the threat in Italy where actually a far-right party and a far-right leader was actually in the possibility of becoming Prime Minister of Italy, which actually brings us back to the dark ages of Europe. And his policies against Roma, against Muslims, against migrants, against women, against LGBTIQ people are very worrying. But what's even more worrying is how these far-right leaders in Europe are working with the current US administration and other far-right political parties and leaders across the world. We see that in South America with Brazil, we see that in the Philippines, we see that in Europe, we see that in the United States. And that's why it's important for us to work transatlantically. It's why it's important that we bring our communities together to face this threat. As you said, the threat we face in Europe is not only limited to Europe, it's also happening in the US. We see, since this current administration has come to power, we see the threats to minorities. But what is even more worrying is we see how others, for example, in 2016 in the US presidential election, how the Russians used foreign interference based on the polarization, how they pitted minorities online against each other. So if we don't deal with the polarization, we also open ourselves up to the vulnerability of foreign interference who will play on that polarization. We've seen how the Russians have empowered in Europe both the far left and the far right. And we see how they're using that to cause divisions in our society. And that is something that we need to tackle. And that is why it's important for policymakers in Europe and the US to wake up to the reality of racism, discrimination, and fascism, and why it's needed that we tackle it. And it's also, in that case, what we're seeing is not attacks on one community, but on all communities, whether it's Jewish people, whether it's Muslims, whether it's LGBTI people, whether it's people who are Roma or Black. And these communities have to come together. And that's where our role as people working in policy making have to understand how we bring our communities together, even if we have divisions. The shared threat is the same. It's the populism, it's the racism, it's the fascism. It may be specific to each individual community, but we have to understand that threat is together. And we have to say something in Europe today that I would say that both the left and the right has been complacent. And in some cases, it's not just the right that has empowered the populists and the racists, but we've also seen on the left how the left has copied some of the policies of the extreme far right. When it comes to migration, when it comes to minorities, we see right now in Denmark a social democrat government, a center-left government, actually enacting policies on migration that are actually very right-wing. So we also have to understand that everyone from all political sides has a duty to combat this. And I would end here to say that in the transatlantic space, the key areas where we can work together are, of course, on discrimination, security, countering violent extremism, terrorism, migration, but also issues around employment. We can learn, and we can learn from colleagues in the US, but activities in the US, which seek to boost the chances of minority populations to access not only good quality education, but a transition into employment. And what I would say to you today, as I've said many times before when I've been here, is that we need the Congressional Foreign Affairs Committee, the Helsinki Commission to keep on pushing the State Department. In a time of cuts at the State Department, and at times where we're seeing the State Department sometimes even work with our opposition, the far right in Europe, we need Congress and the Senate to stand up and say, this is unacceptable. That we need to actually empower the minorities in Europe instead of empowering the people who are against the minorities. And the final thing I would say, which is a bit more tricky for colleagues in the US, is the issue of online and hate speech online. Of course, in the US, you have a different perception on freedom of expression. But we believe, and we've worked at the European level with the big tech companies, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, Snapchat, to see how we can take down content within 24 hours that incites hatred. And we would like your support there to see how, both working from Congress, the Senate, and the State Department, how you can support our efforts in Europe. Thank you.
Been a great panel, and I'm sure that we have more questions than we do time, but I want to yield now to one of the Helsinki Commission is a bicameral, bipartisan commission, and so one of our senior members in the House is my good friend Steve Cohen, and I will yield to him at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know how that comes from bicameral, because we're all on the same camel, the House, and bipartisan, we're all Democrats. And while I don't look African-American, I have the largest African-American district in the United States, percentage-wise. So I represent African-Americans, I understand the plight of African-Americans, and I'm Jewish, so I understand the plight of Jews, but I don't have to be a Jew, and I don't have to have an African-American district to understand the Roma and other discrimination, women, that goes on around the world. The chair was quite positive and uplifting when she heard from the representative from the Netherlands and said, "Oh, I'm so thrilled to see that the young are here and carrying on and continuing the fight." And that was positive, and I commend you for that. I'm a little more droll than that, cynical maybe, but my thoughts were, it's still going on, and it's gone on since the start of mankind. And discrimination and hatred and intolerance and dividing people by race and gender and religion and every other way imaginable has gone on for time immemorial. And as far as the Jewish situation in Europe and its racism, the pogroms in Russia, Hitler and the concentration camps, and it goes back to Spain and the Inquisition. Relative to that, the United States has been pretty good to Jews. But we've got a lot of anti-Semitism here as well. And I've been in Hungary, and I know the situation there is not good. And I've been in Poland, and I know the situation there is not good. There are problems around the world. So back to the chair and her optimism, I commend each of you for taking on your role in politics and being involved, especially the two young ones here. They're not the squad, they're the duo, I guess. But you've got a great mission. Carry it on and be strong. To Mr. Franz, let me ask you this. When I was in Hungary, I learned a lot about discrimination against the Roma. I've seen it everywhere. In the Balkans, it's great. Are there any countries where it's better or worse in Europe? Is Roma discrimination pretty constant, or are there places that treat the Roma better and places that treat the Roma worse?
Thank you for this question. I think we must say the discrimination in Hungary is, so we have in Hungary a president, you know, Orban, and he has laws that when you are homeless, you go in jail. When you get social benefit and you don't work for the community or the state, you get no social benefit. When you get no social benefit, you go homeless. When you go homeless, you go in jail. And then they say, okay, we have for the education for the Roma people, for the Roma childs, we have a program. It looks so. They have segregation in the education that calls. In the past, they says the Roma childs are sick in the brain, and then they need special schools. And that calls, now they go to special schools, to Roma schools, and they are with 14, they leave the school, and they must work. But in Hungary, it's so that are from poverty affected people, they get no work, they must work for the social benefit. And then you find it's not 100%, but I say 90%, maybe. In East Europe, we have the problem that more than 90% of our people with Somali background are without work. And you have the problem not only in East Europe, in Germany too, when you're looking for an education place, for a profession or for a job, and you say you are a Sinto or a Sintitsa or Romni, then you have very less chance to take this job. It's really so. And, or you have the change to, the chance to, wie sagt man, verstecken? To hide your ethnicity. Then you have a chance. And that's...
Well, I understand there's a problem, and you've described it well, but are there certain countries that deal with it better and are more accepting and tolerant than others, and are they the worst? Give me the best two places for a Roma to live and have an opportunity, and the worst two.
My experience is Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, and this country, it's very, very, very bad situation. And I think when I was in Germany or the Netherlands, it's much better. But that calls, when we have the studies in these countries, in Germany too, the last studies was more than 50% of the German was asked about Sinti and Roma, they say, we don't like Sinti and Roma. You must kick it out from the land. And we must know that my family lives like more than 600 years in Germany. And we have a big problem too. We must change now the narratives in Europe. I have said this, that most people, or when we go to Europe in the policy, they speak from a Roma problem, Sinti problem, refugee problem, and I say, no, that's a mistake. We have no Roma, Sinti, or refugee or migrant problem. We have a racism problem in our policy and in the majority. That's really, really important to change the narratives, and then you can change your focus. And all the strategies, what we had in the past, was paternalistic strategies. The affected people was never a part of the conception, and they don't. It was never an equal partnership. And then now, there was in the past, in the early past, we had the Roma strategy. Now they end. The evaluations shows they failed. And why? Paternalistic approaches. The affected people was only victims. And that's, I think, that we must change. No paternalistic approaches, and we must take these affected people from anti-Gypsyism as an equal partner, to participate as equal partner. And I say what your question, I think in East Europe, we have very bad situation, but no, it was in the early past, was in Italy too. Salvini was there, and he wants ethnical data from Sinti and Roma. That makes the Nazis too.
Let me ask you, because I understand what you're saying. The Roma and the Jews have often been what's called the canary in the coal mine. When they first experience it, and it's a sign that there's racism coming, because they're often the first to be discriminated against. In Germany, I read yesterday, and I hope it was inaccurate, but I suspect it was not, that a man was named a mayor who's a neo-Nazi somewhere, I think it was near was it Dresden, I forget where. How did that come to pass? A neo-Nazi appointed mayor. And is that a sign of a problem?
This is in the country Hessen, called Hessen. It's in a little village. And they have the people on this little council was not there. And he was elected, and the Nazi was there.
Elected by the council?
Yeah.
So it's just a small group of people.
But now they see the media came and see that, and now they say, oh, we must take it from his place, and so now they want to do this. But that shows the problem what we have in Germany too. Now the last elections in Sachsen and Brandenburg shows that one party, the AfD, it's very far right, they have 27% from the people choose this AfD, 27%, and that's very makes me very scared about the situation in East Germany.
Thank you. I think my time is probably short, but I do want to comment that I appreciate what each of you are doing. And I have to say, and maybe I am being, grouping people, and that's wrong to do, but I was thinking back upon my experiences in Europe. There are a lot of women have been elected leaders in Europe. Germany and I think Lithuania and other places we've had women leaders. America hadn't quite done it. And most of the awful people have been white males. You got our president, you got your man in Poland, you got your man in Hungary, you got your guy in Brazil, the man in Turkey's not so wonderful. We got a problem. So women, y'all got to get to work. Get some of those guys out of there. I yield back for balance of it.
Thank you, Steve. You can see why he has a majority African American district, and he gets like 85% of the vote. So who, you know, and I asked him why, and he said because we know him. I am so happy. Before I yield to my colleague to my right, I'm so happy to introduce one of our newer Helsinki commissioners, Mark Vesey from Fort Worth, Texas. He's a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which deals with healthcare and also with energy, and also a member of the Small Business Committee. But before I yield to him, I want to yield to my colleague, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is
Member of the Financial Services Committee again, yeah.
I appreciate the fact that all of our guests have been kind enough to come and perhaps even give us some direction. I don't know if any of us can go right to the moment that we started experiencing this new, well, it's new for this era, explosion of intolerance that is not only rising in Europe. It's almost like it's contagious, and it has maybe it started on these shores. But one of my concerns is, I mean, I don't know whether this is asking too much, but are there any things that you have seen, any of you, that could be used as a best practice in terms of reducing the intolerance and the division? Is there anything that you think would be an antidote for this poisonous atmosphere that is being created? Any, or all of you? Any?
Yes. Well, thank you. I'll answer first. Well, I right away think about my experience at the Netherlands police. The Netherlands police is known for having community policing. And the essence of that is that you engage communities, that you literally go to communities, that you speak to them, that you, again, raise the right questions. What are you dealing with? Would you like to come also to us to see our practice, to see our work, and maybe we can think about solutions together. And I think, well, now being in politics myself, I noticed that having this this grassroots tactic. So make sure that you are visible as a politician or as a police officer, but as a politician, and that you engage with communities and not only being there, but also trying to make sure that the input that you get, that you bring that literally back to the table and make sure that you create proposals, resolutions, etc., so that also the communities see that you really do something about it. And I think that's really necessary also to counter intolerance, because in that way you also teach society why it is important to think about certain solutions and why it is important to propose different kind of resolutions. I think that if politicians, if people working with society are constantly not bringing the worries and thoughts of different communities back to the table, then you get this perception, this really strong perception of people thinking not being engaged. And I think that's, well, I've learned from how the police did that with the community policing, and that inspired me also, partially in making sure that I'm a grassroots politician myself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. In addition to what my colleague said, I would like to highlight two things. The first, on a political level, the first is that I think that it's important that democratic parties actually understand the importance to cooperate with each other. I mean, in Sweden, for example, if I take my own country as an example, for the first time, for a long time, the Social Democratic Party, my own party, the Green Party, went together with the two liberal parties, the Center Party and the Liberal Party, and decided that, okay, in order to be able to not give more power and political influence in the hand of the Sweden Democrats, the right-wing extremist party, we need to cooperate over the blocks, so over the center-right and center-left blocks. So that was, I think, one important step to take in order to not give the extremists more influential power on policies. However, the most important, though, I would say, is to address the root causes. And the root causes, from my perspective, is called inequality. Because if we look at how it looked in Europe the last decades, and we look at just 2 decades back until 2008, sorry, 1 decade back until 2008, 2009, when the economic crisis hit Europe pretty hard. That's what I would say, at least, even though, of course, it has been bubbling before that also, but the economic crisis gave power to these extremist organizations and parties to grow on. So what they started to do is to put people with immigrant backgrounds and people with non-immigrant backgrounds against each other. But not only that, they also, experience from my own country is that they go to people who immigrated to Sweden during the 50s, 60s and say, look, you were a part of building up the society. The new immigrants are part of dismantling the society. So putting even people with immigrant groups against each other and saying that the new people are destroying the society, and the money goes to them. So if they were not here, the healthcare would be better, the education would be better. Mm-hmm. But what they do not say, like 2018, when we had the national election, the Sweden Democrats voted in favor of the right-wing, the conservative budget, which meant lowering taxes after taxes after taxes. And of course, if you lower taxes, it means that you cannot either build up the welfare states that secures that the elderly have good pensions, that children have good access to good education, that we all have good access to good and quality healthcare, and so on and so on. So I think addressing the root causes is one of the best way in a long term, in a long term, to make sure that these kind of organizations and parties do not grow even stronger than they are doing right now. But the short term is that the democratic parties, instead of legitimatizing these kind of forces, they should get together, the democratic parties, and make sure to find a way of cooperating. Thank you.
Great discussion, great conversation. Before we introduce our last panel, we're gonna hear from Mark VC. He has some questions of the panel.
Madam Chair, thank you very much, and great to be here today to talk about this very important, panel of these panelists, but then the questions that they're dealing with too, I think are really timely, particularly considering everything that's going on around the world as we look for different ways that we can stabilize the world. And I wanted to ask you specifically about hate speech, because that can really be sort of a tricky topic. I was in France recently, and someone talked about how, like in France, when people come to the country, they really want everyone to become French, right? Like that they very much value their culture there. And so when people come to that country, I was told that they put a very high value on everybody becoming French. And, and you take a country like Rwanda, for instance, that had terrible atrocities committed there, obviously, back during the 1990s. And of course, they have pretty much banned, people talking about their ethnic background there. So you can't do that there. So they want everybody to be Rwandans. How do you have a society, especially in Western countries, how do you have a society in places like Germany and the Netherlands that value free speech and value free expression and also allow people to have different opinions or on issues that may be controversial or that make people uncomfortable and also maybe considered hate speech? Like how do you balance that? Because I know that we even have a hard time here. I mean, one of the things that our Constitution values is the fact that we have a Constitution that protects speech that is unpopular, that makes people uncomfortable here in the United States. The First Amendment was designed not for popular speech, but actually for speech that can really make people, not necessarily feel good about the place that they're in. So, do you have any, thoughts on that, particularly with everything that's happening in Europe right now?
So, may I answer? We have in Germany what I find is much more terrible that the hate speech, that how the political men now are speaking. I give you some example. For example, the General Secretary said one in an interview, it might be that Jérôme Boateng, that's some football star in Germany. His father is from Nigeria and his mother is a white German. And the General Secretary said it might be a good footballer, but nobody want him as a neighbor. Or for 3 weeks, on the 2nd of August, the president of the Federal Association of Football said, in front of 2,000 people, we can stop all the problem, the climate problem, if we plant a lot of trees, so the African people are stopped to make children in the night. It's terrible, something like that. The way how the political men, usually today in Germany, are speaking, I find it is much more terrible. It's very terrible, because when you say that in the television, somebody like the minister president who said, for example, yes, from when migrant people are coming here and they stay 3 years and then they are Catholic and they are serving in the church, you cannot spare them out, kick them out, and a lot of things like that. And I think, first of all, we have, as political, we who are in the parliament, we have really to demand that the art, the way how they are speaking is not acceptable. It's not acceptable that the new elected president of the Commission, European Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, said, oh, we have to protect the way of life of Europe. It means if you are not European, you are a threat for the country. And those type of things are not, from my point of view, is not acceptable. That's why each time when somebody makes something like that, I write an open letter and I publish them in the newspaper. And I think we have to increase the education and awareness of children. And I was very long years, I was teacher in a high school. And I introduced at that time the week against racism, because we are in Germany, is a problem. When you say I am German, German is white. Yes, if I say I am a German political woman, everybody say what? No, and we have to increase education. So the children now, you might be from origin, from Asian, from Roma, from what you want, and you said you are German. We have the same value, and that value we can get them in the school as a teacher. And I know what I am saying because I was very long years teacher. And if you get the children now, the young people who are going to be the political leader in the future, that racism, that the worst thing for you first, for you, yourself. For yourself is bad, but also for your society. And it's possible today that our society, the German society, is, how we said, a multicultural society. And to be German doesn't mean you are just white and you have some ideas about other people. I think that's the problem for us in Germany. Hate speeches. I read that a lot of black women have got a very bad hate speeches. For myself, I didn't get, I must say I didn't get what I have. I was attacked from Nazi people during the campaign, a long time a campaign. I was attacked. Yes, it was a Nazi people who wanted to spray on the eyes and so on. But I must say,
you were physically attacked.
I was physically attacked. But I must say, really, that the people who were there defend them were shocked, because in our country, where I am living, we always said we are open. We are an open city, and we are open by tradition. Because in Erlangen, the first migrant people who came were the French people in the 16 years with the Huguenots. Yes, and that's why. It is possible. We have to give a best practice, and best practice, education. Yes. Second one, best practice. This education is not just today to say, yes, today we are going to speak about racism. No, we make it in the school. For example, I introduced at that time what we said, the school without racism and school with courage. And I hope I can make it in the European Parliament that all the schools in Europe might be, are going to be school without racism, school with courage. It means that you involve all the children. The children are going to say, okay, we want to be a school without racism. We are going to commit it ourselves, and we make each year as a panel, and we invite people, and so we are going to try to change our society, because the new society is a multicultural society, and it's possible that we live together, and our children have another perspective of the way of life in Europe, or not as a threat, but as a gain for everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. This is really great. Okay, we're going to hear from you, and we're going to move on to our second panel. But
I
you
think
can weigh in.
on the issue of freedom of speech, I mean, I think first of all, we're living in a bit of a hyperbole in the situation that there's a lot of reports about censorship and freedom of speech and hate speech. In many member states, the penal code and the jurisprudence is pretty clear about what constitutes incitement to hatred and hate speech. The IT companies, the major IT companies, have signed code of conducts which clearly stipulate, what they should take down and what they can't take down. And in Europe, we do have this idea that whilst freedom of speech is something to be welcome, it is not absolute. in Europe. And when it starts to become incitement to hatred, that's when we have to take action. And I think the best way to counter it, and this is a best practice, is when we're talking about changing the narrative. It's a bit rich for me to say working for the anti-racism intergroup to change the narrative, but we can't always be anti. We have to start to look how we change the narrative into a more positive narrative. Europe is changing demographically, just like the United States. Europe is becoming more multiracialized, right? The minorities getting out the vote, minorities are becoming more integrated in terms of voting, in terms of representation, and so on. So what we need to keep on talking about is not just always talking about the anti-racism, the anti-this. What we need to start talking about is how we change the narrative into a positive narrative. Our social welfare states, our healthcare, pensions, everything relies on more migration to Europe because of an aging population. The demographics are changing. So we know that in the end, we have to start to talk in that kind of narrative, the positive narrative. And that actually comes back to what I would end on here to talk about is how do we work in an intersectional way, but how do we work with different groups coming together? So where we have seen good and best practices, for example, is when the Jewish and the Roma community have come together in Europe to talk about the Holocaust and to bring more attention to the Roma victims of the Holocaust, but also to apply how what happened in the Holocaust affects modern day life for Roma and Jewish people. How what we're seeing in Hungary, the attacks on civil liberties, on academic freedom, on civil society, on shrinking space, but also, as you say, on Jewish communities, George Soros has been attacked. These go back to what we saw in the Holocaust, the tactics, the campaigning. And the only way we can counter that is if we come together and we start to create a new narrative together. We don't let them divide us, but we bring our communities together and say, okay, we're going to work through the hard discussions. If you're Muslim and Jewish, we're going to try to have the conversation about Israel, Palestine, but that shouldn't prevent us from working together as communities. We should see the bigger picture. The same thing with the Black community in Europe, the same thing with the Roma community, the same thing with the LGBTI community. We need to overcome the differences and start to change the narrative to a more positive narrative, also looking at where Europe is going to end up in 2040. Let's talk about Europe, the vision of 2040. Just like in the United States, you talk about, the 2042 multiracialized society vision. That's how we should be thinking about it in Europe. Thank you.
Can I add only one more thing?
One more thing. Okay, here we go. This is a really compelling conversation. We appreciate you flying all the way over here, so go on.
So I totally agree. We need to change the narrative, and that means that we need to bring in people that can either change that narrative and are allowed to speak up. But it's not easy. It's not easy when you're one of the first trying to change the narrative, but that doesn't mean you need to stop with that. So it is really important that the people that are coming in, trying to work on that narrative, trying to tell another story, trying to represent communities that are not in politics or in government enough now, that they feel supported. So it is extremely important that we support. It doesn't mean that we do not need to speak up, but speaking up is really necessary, but it also comes with a lot of challenges, like also being attacked, being challenged, but we also need to make sure that these people are being protected. So otherwise, we do have the representation, but on the other hand, not speaking up or not feeling safe to do that.
This is very, very great. We want to thank this panel. Uh-oh. I think I don't want to be unfair to our other guests. We have a very great second panel here, and they've traveled far as well. So we're going to invite our first panel to stick with us, and we're going to introduce our second panel here. We have Dominica Bidu of the Netherlands. She's vice chair of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance and an international human rights expert. Irene Apaya serves as city councilor in Hamburg, Germany, and has been a leader on Afro-German initiatives. We have MP Danielle Obono, who's a member of the French Parliament and a member of the Constitutional Laws, Legislation, and General Administration Commission, Constitutional Commission of the National Assembly, as well as the European Affairs Commission, where she serves as Bureau Secretary and a member of the Overseas Territories Delegation. And last but certainly not least, our Member of Parliament, Olivier Serva, who's the president of the Delegation of French Overseas Territories in the French Parliament. We look forward to your questions. I want to say to our first panel, I had many, many questions I want to ask you myself, but I really, really appreciated your participation. And again, this conversation is just starting. Take this time while things are being set up to thank our Helsinki staff. The woman that you see putting the placards there is Dr. Thompson. And she leads all of our efforts here. She has a marvelous staff that works with her. And we appreciate Dr. Thompson's diligence. She's here now, but she's been, you've been to Vienna and stationed there, and she's a very hard worker. All right, we're going to get right into the second panel, and I'm not going to delay because time is waning. So let's get right to it. And Dominica Bidu of the Netherlands, let's start with you.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I feel honored to be here and to share my experience from the point of view of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, as well as my own experience as a first-generation refugee from Eritrea coming to Europe as an accompanied minor and climbing to this position. So even though in Europe we don't believe in the European dream, I every now and then say we should and create space. So I would like to first start to explain what we do as the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. So what we see that the increasing xenophobic and populism and hate speech is persisting, as all the other colleagues have already said, concerning in Europe, one of the most challenging. If anything, over the last 2 or 3 years, the problem has grown, possibly as a result of the multiple crises of Europe has been facing during the several years now, austerity policy, migration on a scale that hasn't been seen in modern history, and the related challenges of integration and increasing number of terrorist attacks. People's fear and uncertainties have instrumentalized by nationalistic and xenophobic movements. Racist insults and xenophobic hate speech has reached unprecedented level and entered, in many cases, the political mainstream. The role of ECRI is of paramount importance. We have been created in 1993. We are celebrating our 25th anniversary coming at the end of September as an independent human rights monitoring body within the Council of Europe. We are entrusted with the task of combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and intolerance from the perspective of the protection of human rights. We are composed of 47 independent experts, one from each member state of the Council of Europe. So it's not just the UN, it's not just the EU, but we are 47 member states. And we have close collaboration with the OSCE in our monitoring work, and we cross-refer on each other's work. So a government proposed a member, so all members come together 3 times a year in our sessions. Our work consists of country monitoring and work on general themes through developing so-called general policy recommendations, and we work with civil societies. So just also referring to the question which was stated a while ago, one of our main issue is addressing hate speech and hate-motivated violence, and also effective equality and access to rights and integration and inclusion. We have adopted a general policy recommendation number 16 dealing on hate speech. That puts that various findings and recommendations from countries, visits, and overall cohesive frame to provide advice the various sectors, such as how we can do to combat racism in employment, education, sport, and policing. So in all our work, when we do country monitoring, we look at a variety of situations in the different countries. So coming to hate speech, it's our general policy recommendation number 15 has the definition we are using is that significance is the advocacy promoting an assignment of any forms of denigration, hatred, or vilification of a person or group based on personal characteristic or status, as well as harassment, insults, negative stereotyping, stigmatization, or a threat on that basis. So that's the definition. The forms of expression that incite are likely incite acts of violence, intimidation, hostility, or discrimination on race, color, language, religion, belief, nationality, and national and ethnic origin and descent. However, this is not an exhaustive list of personal characteristics. For example, ECRI considers sexual orientation also as a ground which will be covered within this definition of protecting and combating hate speech. So it's very important the work we do and what we need from the member states. We are always stressing on it when we are doing our monitoring work is to ensure that we have a robust legislation in place to tackle discrimination at constitutional level and civil and administrative law and criminal level as well. To apply legislation consistently and systematically. So that's the main thing we are stressing on. We would like also to ensure that independent equality bodies exist and function properly to promote equality and prevent discrimination, support people exposed to discrimination, intolerance, and promote diversity and good relation between persons belonging to different groups in society. So here is where the intersectionality comes, and also the importance that equality body not only do this work, but they are also preaching, practicing what they preach. So inclusion within their work and framework, we see that as a very important additional thing when we are doing our monitoring work. We need to establish diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy policies, ensuring full access to basic rights such as education, employment, health, and housing, as well as language and integration courses, acquisition of legal status, participation in public life, and family reunification. We need to recognize that integration of migrants is a two-way process, but the emphasis by the state should move from integration to inclusion. Inclusion underlines the need for society not only to facilitate the adaptation of the migration to society, but rather also for society to be changed in order to be able to fully accept and include the person. This can, for example, be facilitated by tolerance programs and also by intercultural awareness raising. A friend of mine, she has created what she calls a Katikoti table, in which it's a realm of the commemoration of the abolishment of slavery in the Netherlands and how we need to heal, and also in our daily life, really creating cohesive society where we are really meeting each other and going beyond the pain we have experienced. But that shouldn't be an excuse not to work together. So it means that not only on policy level, but we are working together on day-to-day in creating society. So when you would ask us, how can the US help Europe in going forward to create inclusive societies? I'm very happy we are having this kind of encounters that we are having today. Even though we acknowledge the dark side of our histories, as Europe, as you have said, as a colonial, with its colonial past, its slavery past, and also the dark side of the US. We really acknowledge that, like the migration and integration, for example, the internment of Japanese American, the genocide of native population and segregation laws and policies. But we are also at the same time inspired by the American resilience and the opportunities which has made it possible to create a diverse country, and also opportunities which made it possible to create notable successes in common living and cultural diversity. So you are also our role models. This must be preserved and further flourished with good examples, and we recognize that DS as a partner in peer in our continued effort to combat racism and intolerance, and to end, we would like to urge the state to engage in counter-populistic rhetoric. As you have asked, what can be done against hate speech? So counter-rhetoric is a very important instrument which can be used. Another thing is foster constructive and peaceful relationship between the Western world and the Muslim countries and between Muslim countries and Israel, because that's the root causes which is really fueling so much trouble. We would really recommend that create guidelines for practices to combat discrimination and intolerance, like for example, our own GPR on combating intolerance and discrimination against Muslim, our GPR number 9, the fight against anti-Semitism, and our GPR 9016, safeguarding irregular present migration from discrimination. So even a person, if it's irregularly present in a country, doesn't mean that it's not a human person and is protected with its human rights. And as the last thing I would like to recommend is also creating structures to combat hate speech, as I said, our GPR number thing. I would like to conclude by saying that it would be very important, if it's possible, that the US also would seek an observer status in the plenary meeting of ECRI. That would be an opportunity to deepen our transatlantic relationship and cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and please take note. Our time is wasting, and I'm a very bad chair because I'm so excited about you all being here that I'm not really strictly enforcing the time limits, but we do want to hear from everyone. So Ms. Apaya, guten Tag, welcome. She's a city councilor in Hamburg, Germany. We're happy to hear from you.
Thanks for having me. Dear members of Congress, I am deeply honored to receive this invitation to speak to you today and give you a small insight of being an African German political leader born and raised in Hamburg. My name correctly pronounced is Irene Appiah.
Appiah.
Appiah, coming from Ghana originally. I'm newly elected since May, and I became the first Black councillor in a local district of a city called Hamburg, Hamburg City. Yeah, according to German statistics, citizens with African nationality hold approximately 5.1%. That's 511,000 people of the total German population. Our statistic in Hamburg proves that out of 46,000 registered Africans, 2/3 hold a German passport. In addition, from what research I could find, at least 15% are citizens with undocumented status. But still, people of color, mostly Africans, Roma, and Muslims, are confronted with prejudice and discrimination. With that being said, I would like to concentrate on the time frame since the UN Decade for People of African Descent has unfolded its effect. We have this word in German, Existenzangst.
I saw that, yeah.
It is a little bit difficult to translate into English, however, I'm going to try. It's this fear of disappearing, this existential sort of social anxiety that has taken over like a virus of the mind. Existenzangst has flamed the fires of xenophobic violence, discrimination, and abuse throughout all of society. Attacks which has stopped around the early 2000s. Because of the recent upsurge in immigration settlement, we are now having a return of xenophobically motivated attacks like we had in the early 80s and 90s, caused by hatred and ignorance and unresolved, so-called, issues that remains, but you don't really have no reason. The increasing number of neo-Nazi groups who feel comfortable in verbalizing their ideology, new tone of misanthropic expression in politics, which is being reflected in rules, in some rules and regulation, and during current elections. On a positive note, the number of parliamentarians of African descent have doubled, in some cases tripled, taken seats on all political levels. Africans are more likely to be actively included in committees, bodies, unions, and boards. Activists are organizing themselves and joining forces to push diversity interest. Religious institutions with their significant numbers of members are the neoteric associations who need support in self-organizational efforts. Many religious leaders are unaware of the potential ecumenical public-private partnership with local, state, and federal government entities. However, I'm taking it, I'm losing it.
You're doing great.
The average fellow citizen is slowly feeling represented. Our demands, our interests, and our needs are becoming more visible, and in some cases, even recognized. I became politically active in 2012 and have always addressed discrimination against African citizens. In 2014, when we won our district election, me missing out on a seat by 25 votes, I was still asking to phrase a paragraph for the coalition agreement, which set a focus on the African community living within the municipality. For the first time in Hamburg's history, our African community became visible in political matters. The focus was set for 5 years and reflected on the matters of youth, social, labor, and public housing. I then founded a working group for African Germans, mostly of Democrats, but also allowing no party members to participate and push the political matter further. Another positive light of a governmental action is based on having our first African representative, Dr. Diaby Karamba, in federal parliament. In his awareness of the UN Decade reference, he influenced the federal coalition contract by setting cultural heritage, colonialism, escape, and expulsion on the federal agenda, making it a task for all cultural authorities in the countries to develop measurements for reclamations. Following, the Cultural Authority in Hamburg is currently developing new procedures for the recognition of colonialism within their field. The authorities have installed an advisory board, including the expertise of individuals and our association members of African heritage and POCs. The existence of the UN Decade of People of African Descent and its fruitful network is helping to create more awareness for issues and personalities of minorities in our society. A good example is the promotion of Representative Aminata Touré by becoming Vice President of State Parliament. First time in German's history to place a person of African heritage at such a high position. The Charter helps establish more activities and political organizational groups. More empowerment workshops and political debates have been initiated. So my recommendations to the Commission would be to make the impact of the UN Charter even more sustainable. I believe it is necessary that all state parties who signed the contract of the High Commission of Human Rights must declare a commitment to take measurements in case disadvantaging gaps has been indicated by the UN expert working group. I forgot one thing about the educational part. Children and youth face discrimination at early ages in kindergarten, schools, in vocational trainings and university. There is a tendency to quickly sort out schoolboys and categorize them as children with special educational needs. And what I do at the Ministry of Education, that's where I work when I'm not in politics, I develop intercultural learning action plans for schools. My observation is the majority of teachers and pedagogues are not prepared in their field of studies to handle the diversity of their students. Most of them lack social and intercultural competences. They lack the skill to include diversity in their classrooms. So there's urgently something needed to be done on that field too. Okay, in order to have effective measurements, the state must provide statistical data of minority groups and make use of the existing competences of the African in diaspora. Equity of minority groups can only succeed if minority councils are embodied to ensure inclusion in various boards, bodies, and institutions, especially on boards of chambers of commerce, financial institutions, boards of media houses. Minority councils therefore will need funds to build up in order to deal with the competitive standards and structures.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up, though.
The High Commission must either involve UN prosecutor in trials abroad or take on these cases to the European Court of Human Rights, because we have a lot of cases, unresolved cases, where it's clear that the minority is not being served. Minority groups need support to build an own media network with the transatlantic connection. I think
I've been taking copious notes, really. I'm sure you have so much more to share,
Yes.
but I took notes. And I am so happy now to have MP Daniele Obono, a member of the French Parliament. Bonjour.
Bonjour. Thank you very
The
much.
best of my French and German today, the very best.
That's the best beginning, at least. Thank you very much for having me, for having us today. I'm the first-time member of Parliament in France and the proud representative of the 70th constituency electoral district in Paris. It's comprised part of the 18th and 19th district of Paris in the northeast. It's a very beautiful place. Historically, it's a working class and migrants area. It encompasses two of the poorest neighborhoods in Paris, with an overrepresentation of persons with few diplomas, large families, and single-parent families. 7 out of 10 households live in public housing, and the poverty rate is of 31%, double as much as the general rate in the city. It faces a lot of challenges, whether it's gentrification or homelessness crisis. There's also beginning of crack epidemic, and the way the state have failed migrant people who have been abandoned in the district and left to die into the street. It's also one of the most creative, vivid, and human part of Paris. I would greatly invite you to come and visit and go beyond the River Seine and the lights in the Saint-Germain to visit this wonderful place. Well, you'll meet welcoming people and very generous people. They look like what French is now. French society has actually always been, which is multicultural, with a lot of diversity. That's not what is being shown in the television or in the political scene or any other public place, but that's the reality of what French is and has been for decades and centuries, actually. Because there is, and there's always been diversity in the French population. Nowadays, it's around 8 to 9% of the French population that were born foreign, in a foreign country, which is the definition of immigrants by the French government. It's roughly 6 million people. It's a very stable figure. And out of those people considered immigrants in France, 42 come from Africa and 37 from Europe. You have religious diversity that has also always existed in France. The majority of French people declare themselves to be Christian, around 60%, 30% are without religion, 6 to 7% are Muslims, 1% roughly are Jewish, and 2 to 3 don't belong to any faith. The problem in France, so, is not about this diversity or discovering this diversity. It's always been there. The problem is diversity in France is used as a term that only makes sense in a society where groups of body have been marked as others for a long time, systematically and therefore excluded. It is only because the society has delusion itself as homogeneous that it has to rethink itself as diverse. Europe and France has produced hegemonic ideologies aimed at justifying accaparation of goods, destruction of cultures, enslavement of people, systematic oppression. And although this has been documented in numerous scientific researches, French governments have successively failed to acknowledge what this tradition of marking people as others has for consequences. There's an extreme control of the semantics when talking about discrimination, and the refusal to see racism as a power relation, a matter of domination, the refusal to talk about race relation, the debate about around the wording to talk about Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, and the continuous talk and cartoon talk about anti-white racism. Recently, we had a media frenzy when the world-famous Lilian Thuram, who is a 1998 soccer world champion, is a very esteemed figure. It's a black man, and he has been talking about racism in sport, in football, and he was denouncing white supremacy, and he's been attacked by some media and sport experts, saying that he was, when he denounced white supremacy philosophy, that he was anti-white racist. And the whole talk, rather than focusing on what black football player being abused and called names on the field, rather than confronting that, was about accusing Lilian Thuram, who spent decades fighting against racism. This shows a small example among many how the whole situation is used against the very people who are victims of racism in France. The refusal to recognize the numerous historically produced discriminations impacting people living in France has also led French governments to be quite reluctant in implementing any real policy progress in matter of non-discrimination. So the notion of diversity that is politically implemented is therefore largely a conditional one. Diversity is a question of public image, having a photo of people read as diverse. Diversity is a question of integration. The persons read as diverse are to be accepted, make themselves good enough, respectable enough, in order to make into the pre-existing space. But the space doesn't have to change. And the result of that historical and political and also economic power relation is that we as a society have failed again and again to fight systemic discrimination. We have now numerous reports from esteemed body like the National Advisory Commission on Human Rights or the right defenders that have showed how people are victims of systemic discrimination. In 2017, 1.1 million people were victims of racist or xenophobic attacks, according to the annual report of the National Advisory Commission on Human Rights in France. Out of those, only 70% complaints of racist abuse and 2% of racist violence had been filed, and this under-declaration is due to the justice system failing actually to serve justice for those victims, or the police refusing to take complaints. So there's massive under-declaration of those facts. But the very facts remain. 60.7% of women and 47.6% of men perceived of Blacks, Arabs, or Asian declared being discriminated against in the professional world, in the access of employment, as well in the evolution of their career, according to a report by the Rights Defender, which is an independent administrative authority working on those issues. In another poll, 80% of young people declaring themselves to be Black or Arab have been stopped for identity control by the police in the last 5 years, whereas 80% of the persons declaring themselves white were not submitted to such control. We've witnessed an increasing in, rather than addressing the issue, the failure kept happening. And I wanted to focus on two issues. The way the government policy have actually failed the people and increased racism and xenophobia. The anti-migrant policies implemented over the past decades. France is the European country that has the most recourse to the detention of migrant people. 51 people were in detention in 2018. And those detention include families with children in situation so bad that even local association and support group have decided not to get into those detention centers anymore in order to protest against the way things have been happening. The other issue I wanted to point out is about police brutality. There's been, over the course of 10 years, 47 unarmed men have died as a result of police intervention and due to racially based stop and search or interrogation. Out of all those cases, no police officer involved have ever been imprisoned.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. And despite European levels institution condemning France on those very issues of the way the police use lethal immobilization techniques in order to arrest people that are not even accused of anything, just to search them, all the way they've been using weapons and what's used to be focused on people of color in the suburbs for years has been now used with a wider range of people, especially in the recent social movement. So we see how first targeting a specific sector of the population, and then it's spread to the entire situation. So there's been on those and issue in particular, and I want to end on that because that's where the social movement and people have been fighting back a lot over the past years. There've been movement to reclaim, ask for justice for people, young Black people being died, being arrested by the police, people like families member and especially sisters and mothers have been standing for justice.
We're going to make sure that we have some questions on that, because I'm going to cut you off now, because we want to hear from the Honorable Monsieur Olivier Serva, who is the president of the delegation of French Overseas Territories in the French Parliament. And we started 10 minutes late, so we're going to go over a little bit. We promised to get people out of here at noon, but we'll welcome your translator, Monsieur Olivier, and we look forward to your remarks, and then that'll give us a couple of minutes to ask you some questions. I have some questions that I really want to direct toward all of you on the panel. So, Monsieur Olivier, you're on.
Thank you. I would like to speak a few words first. On this day, September the 11th,
Yes.
which is not ordinary, we know that it's a day of grief for the United States.
Thank you.
But also for the democratic and civilized humanity. Let me thank you for receiving us on this special day of remembrance and be assured of the solidarity of countries of the European Union and the Caribbean world. Thank you. Fight the fight against all forms of discrimination. The persistence of some form of discrimination against minorities is a matter of concern in France, whether it concerns European countries or French overseas territories. Given my experience as a member of the French Parliament representing my island, Guadeloupe, I can bring my testimony relating to French overseas territories. The delegation for French overseas territories within the French National Assembly, which I had, has been addressing this important issue twice since the beginning of my presidency in 2017. The last report was published in March 2019. This report highlights the difficulties related to the achievement of real equality between minorities and the rest of the population. In most French overseas territories, economic systems keep suffering from many obstacles. A significant socio-economic gap has widened through the years with European countries. On top of a wide economic and social precariousness, one can also add the consequences of global warming, hurricanes, tropical storms, etc., as well as the difficulties related to access to housing, most of the time degraded. Inequalities in access to training lead to educational inequalities. Most of the young people from French overseas territories have to travel to pursue their higher education in Europe. For those who do not have the opportunity to leave for students, the result is lack of motivation and high dropout rates at the local level, above the national average for minorities. Less effective training at the local level also result in inequalities in access to right and to information. Furthermore, there are inequalities of access to health for those living in the French overseas territories. The access to hospitals care is most of the time failing, as it is usually limited to the main city. The organization of the territory is not homogeneous, even though the French overseas territories need to deal with unknown diseases such as chikungunya, Zika, or dengue fever, etc. This often results in a lower life expectancy than the national average. Everyday discrimination is insidious as it often hides in the details. I will back my argument with 3 examples. Bank domiciliation. A person whose bank account is located in a French overseas territory does not have the same right as a person whose bank account is in mainland France. For instance, if my bank account is in Guadeloupe and my child is going to mainland France to study, I cannot provide a guarantee for a loan or a lease for my child. Social security registration is also much more difficult at the administrative level for people coming from these areas of the world. Finally, the right for civil servants, example teachers, to transfer to a French overseas territory is much more difficult to obtain given the small number of places available overseas.
There's nobody here but me, so I can
To face these problems, the delegation of French overseas territories advocates for a number of measures to fight all forms of discrimination, such as to enhance the teaching of the history of slavery on the French overseas territories, to improve the visibility of minorities in the French media, to improve statistical tools to have a better understanding of the minority and their problem of discrimination. In the remote areas of the French overseas territories, to develop public services such as health care or education services. To help our young students to stay in their territories to study for higher education. If they have to go to mainland France to study, we need to help them come back home to work and develop our territories, and by doing this, to fight against the aging of the population. I'm fully aware that these measures have two limits. Firstly, they face budgetary restriction, as most of them are expensive. Then, they face a form of indifference from most of the French citizens. On that particular point, we can all work and use our strength and power as political leaders to fight all forms of discrimination against the minorities. This wonderful event that is a Black Caucus is a perfect proof. Thank you.
Wow, this has really been a great day. My name again is Gwen Moore. I'm a Helsinki commissioner, and I'm here with my good friend, Mr. Emmanuel Cleavers also. I have a question very quickly before I close out and perhaps give Mr. Cleaver an opportunity to ask questions. Very interested in the French delegation. You know, France wants, it is very, very akin to the notion that you want to protect the European way of life, to talk about equality, fraternity in France, where no one can wear the hijab, where they don't get data and statistics on race, which I'm curious as to how you have so many data and statistics on race, since France refuses to allow you to gather those data. And, you know, is that sort of a veil for protecting against those accusations of racism and discrimination? You know, the fact that, you know, you can't really prove racial discrimination, or, there's no way to say you're not hiring Black people. I'm just really, I've been waiting on you to get on this panel to respond to that inquiry.
So yeah, I agree with my colleagues, all of them who pointed out the lack of statistics, and in order to actually treat the problem at the roots. There have been some researchers, not enough, and that's one of the problem. And what they use are the immigrant background and the nationality of the parents and the grandparents, and that how they trace back the ethnicity of the people based on that familial history. There's a very important study, but just one that's been made on that, and that showed the discrimination of, against people who are now French citizens, but whose parents were born in foreign countries and from, former colonial countries. And so the figures are there, not enough, and that's why we need more research and money put into that, and especially to have a more precise idea of the intersection of oppression. And when we talk about Black women from immigrant backgrounds who face specific discrimination, especially on the economic level. So I think it's part of the French ideology of, the Republic being one and only, and not seeing...
So is there no chance that you could legislatively get the government to officially collect data? You got a census coming up, right? Where you count the people. Do you count people every 10 years like we do?
There's a census, but not based on the same kind of statistics. We don't have race statistics in France.
I know, but is it possible to ever change that?
I think it will be maybe.
I mean,
it will answer because it's part of the majority.
is that a problem?
Yeah, it will
that
be.
you
I
don't
think it will
collect
be
data?
a very tricky debate. I don't think it.
Honorable
we're there yet.
Oliver?
We're not there yet.
Je suis très content d'être ici aujourd'hui au Black Caucus.
Okay, you're going to go to Black Caucus? Yeah.
Parce que vous, aux USA, vous avez eu un président de couleur de peau noire.
You have elected a president of color.
Donc vous êtes en avance sur nous, en Europe et en France.
Very forward, a forward country.
Nous voulons, comme vous, avoir une politique de quotas
We
de
want,
discrimination
just
positive.
like you, to have policies with negative quotas of discriminations.
En France, pour l'instant, pour des raisons que vous avez
Currently,
évoquées,
in France, for the reasons we talked about,
il y a une forme de pays des droits de l'homme
There is
et
a
qui
form-
fait qu'il y a une forme d'hypocrisie.
there is a huge hypocrisy because we talk about equality and fraternity.
Nous voulons des personnes issues de la diversité partout et dans des lieux de pouvoir.
We want more diversity everywhere and especially in forms of powers.
Pour l'instant, nos législateurs, nous avons du mal à faire passer cette idée que l'on soit de la minorité ou même de la majorité.
Currently, we have
You want to be in the
trouble.
majority. You can introduce that.
Et c'est pour cela que nous sommes, en tout cas, je suis venu, je suis très content d'être avec ma collègue
That's
Danielle
why I'm
Obono. Sur ce
very
point, nous sommes totalement d'accord.
We agree on that.
Nous avons à nous inspirer de votre façon de faire pour faire avancer les droits de la minorité et pourquoi pas avoir un président de couleur noire
We
en
have
France.
to
Black president.
do the same as you and elect a president of color.
That's right. I understand. I'm ready. Okay. I did have a question. Listen, I just want to, before I turn things over to my colleague here, just say I heard everything everybody said. I was so happy to have Romeo France from Germany, the plight of the 12 million Roma in Europe. Dr. Perrette Hersberger Fofana, the co-president of the European Parliament. I did not know that Black people were German. Black Germans were victims of the Holocaust. I did not even, that's not part of the history, and if I don't know, they don't know either, right? That's what your whole educational thrust has been. I really appreciated hearing from Evan Insir about inequality being the thing we have to tackle to get rid of racism. I'm also impressed by Alfiaz Vaya, coordinator of the European Parliament, who talked about the capacity to deal with defining speech that's different. Hate speech and free speech are not the same thing. And that might be something that we need to look at in terms of reining in this notion that you can just say anything when we know you can't scream fire in a theater. So we might want to take that up. Really appreciate you, Honorable Daniele Obono, for your work and your words, Honorable Oliver, and Samira Rafaela, very old lady, who said that the antidote for racism is community engagement. So I've really taken in a lot, and I want you to know that having come across the pond to visit with us has been worth it for me. I just want to yield now to my colleague, another commissioner, Helsinki Commissioner, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I really appreciate you calling this meeting, and I co-sign what our chair has said in thanking you for your visit, and we appreciate it very much. I just have one question. I'm wondering if in Europe there is name calling for minority groups, be they Muslim or Black or African or Caribbean, You know, if you look at history, in order to do damage to people, first if you want to turn society against them to do damage, the first thing you do is dehumanize them. In Rwanda, in order to kill 1 million Tutsis, they became roaches. If you want to enslave people or do what happened to indigenous people in this country, they became savages. Or a Vietnamese became a gook. Jewish people were supposed to be less human and more vicious. And you just go all the way through history. You need to dehumanize them with something. Does that happen? I mean, for example, we had a whole community in our country, essentially called vermin, not far from here in Baltimore. So is that something that you're hearing in Europe?
If I may speak. Yes. In Germany, I can definitely say yes. We call monkeys. So in that form, that's an animal. And that's like the common treatment of being Black. Yeah, so I can confirm that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for this question. I think it's very important. Dehumanization is the first step in the triangle of hate, and that happens to many societies. So that's also what we do in our monitoring work. We really look at it, and it's one of the points we perceive as the starting of hate and hate speech then. And what happens also is that the bad part of it is that when it's internalized by communities by themselves, yes. So that's really a destructive part of what happens, that you think that what the othering, it's something you do to yourself and also across each other. So creating unity is the best medicine, and that's what we really need to do, and to create a way of seeing the human in the other. And that's a very long process of education. If you may allow me, I would like to also react on the things.
You're the only people missing lunch.
We don't mind. This is an opportunity we don't like to miss. As you said about the French example of statistic, that's something which is present in not only in France, in many countries across Europe. And sometimes the reason why there is no statistics, many times, for example, in the Netherlands, is because we have had this trauma of the Holocaust. So they're saying, because we had a good registration, that's why this could happen. So the reason why it's not done, it's being pointed to that past. But we are visible. So it's not something that you need, not all of us, of course, but many of us are visible. So it's very important to stress on a statistic. So that's what we do also as ECRI when we do our country visits, we stress on statistic. And also the importance, we have legislation and we have the possibility for preferential treatment. It's not called affirmative action, but preferential treatment. And there are steps we should use and we can use. So the instruments are there, but we really need to strategize and campaign for them, that we use that instrument present to really have preferential treatment so that we would reach positions which are there for us as well. So thank you for this question and reminding each other to do what's there.
You were so awesome. I'm definitely going to come to Paris and visit. I would love to come to, I'm sure Ismir is going to get me to Germany. Who was it from Sweden? I'm coming, okay. My nephew lives in Sweden. He woke up one day and asked, why am I colored? And so that's how we found him. So really, we're all in this together. And I think that there's strength in unity. So let's go eat.
I promise I'm not trying to.